From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Hamas kills 6 hostages taken on October 7th, including a 23-year-old U.S. citizen, prompting renewed calls both for the elimination of the terrorist group as well as for Israel to cut some kind of ceasefire deal with it. Plus a post-Labor Day celebration of McJobs, including Kamala Harris's. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, Elliot Kaufman and Bill McGurn. Israeli forces over the weekend recovered the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages from a tunnel under the Gaza city of Rafah, 4 men and 2 women whom Israel said had been shot at close range 2 or 3 days before being found, according to a forensic examination. They included a U.S. citizen, Hersh Goldberg-Polin. Hamas also now saying today, according to the Journal's news story, that it may execute more hostages if Israel doesn't agree to its ceasefire terms. This from the Journal's news story. The implied threat could be an attempt to widen the rifts in Israeli society over the captives and increase pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire deal. Elliot, can you give us a sense of what happened so far as we know with these hostages and how the aftermath is now playing out in Israel?
You described what happened pretty well. What is playing out now is that the pressure is real. The hostages give Hamas significant psychological leverage over Israeli society, and it seems much more than that. It's worth looking at the larger strategic picture here. Hamas had been putting forth a sort of fork in the road for Israel. Make damaging concessions or face regional escalation. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran from afar, something like that. Well, Israel held firm, and that regional escalation, while still a threat, Hezbollah didn't end up delivering on that in a major way. Israel preempted it. Iran didn't end up delivering on that. It still could, but it hasn't, and it has been some time. So what's left? What is left to put this extra pressure on Israeli society? The hostages, executing hostages. And so we've seen very large demonstrations within Israel putting pressure on the government saying, do what you have to do, concede on this or that issue, just get back some of these hostages in a deal. The major Histadrut trade union group tried to hold a day-long general strike on this. A court stopped it halfway because you can't strike over just a purely political issue, but significant pressure at home and from abroad as well. President Biden, when asked, is Prime Minister Netanyahu doing enough to secure a deal? He said no. So Israel's feeling that pressure.
Biden also suggested that the U.S. and Egypt and Qatar are prepared to present another sort of negotiation to Israel and Hamas as a potential ceasefire deal. But Bill, it seems to me there is some tension in these two messages. And I would commend the vice president's statement. It actually has some moral clarity in it. Here's a piece of what Kamala Harris said. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. With these murders, Hamas has even more American blood on its hands. I strongly condemn Hamas's continued brutality, and so must the entire world. From its massacre of 1,200 people to sexual violence, taking of hostages, and these murders, Hamas's depravity is evident and horrifying. The threat Hamas poses to the people of Israel and American citizens of Israel must be eliminated, and Hamas cannot control Gaza, unquote. And Bill, that is a pretty definitive statement from Kamala Harris, but it is somewhat in tension, I think, with this push from President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, and Kamala Harris's previous suggestions that there needs to be some kind of ceasefire deal, which suggests that Israel needs to make the concessions that Hamas wants in order to get some kind of negotiation to the close.
Yeah, Kyle, you're a kind person, and that's why you're being way too polite. The two statements, they're actually opposites. The pressure on the Israeli prime minister to have a ceasefire is what is encouraging Hamas right now to resist. And why would they change? Yes, Kamala Harris's statement was pretty good and pretty clear. She's a candidate now for an election. I'd like to see what her statements are going to be in her policy if she's elected, because I remember Joe Biden's words about the terrorists who killed our Marines and sailors over there at Abbey Gate. He vowed to hunt them down and make them pay a price. He never did. They know what to say. She knows she's suffering from a lot of people who question how tough they'll be given the Biden-Harris administration record. So I really don't believe her protests now. Look, if we were serious, we would back Netanyahu. He has to eliminate this threat. How can you continue and allow this threat? It's like an Evelyn Waugh novel. After October 7th, you would think every civilized person would recognize the Israelis' right to defend itself, which actually includes defending itself, not just in theory. But every time they try to do something, the Biden-Harris people now are there warning against it or blaming them for the violence. So I think Netanyahu has no choice but to ignore the signals coming out of the White House and achieve his military purposes, which are still hard because the kidnapping of people and holding hostages is a war crime. You're not supposed to do it, but it's effective. And it's effective especially the more advanced and civilized the society, because no one wants to see their citizens harmed.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Elliot, what is the state of these negotiations? And the last round that we had in August was a final bridging proposal supported by the U.S. and Egypt and Qatar and accepted in the end by Israel, but refused by Hamas. So what are the sticking points as the U.S. tries to bring another deal to the table?
So that deal from August had final written in the headline on the sheet of paper. Well, Israel said yes, Hamas said no. Turns out it wasn't final. There will be more offers. What's happening right now, the Biden administration has said, is that it's working with mediators Egypt and Qatar on another final proposal, a new final proposal, this time for real, they say. What will that mean? It means trying to bridge some of these last few areas of disagreement, the most prominent of which is this Philadelphia corridor, the thin strip of land separating Gaza from Egypt. Now, why does this strip of land matter? Within Israel, you will have disagreements about, does Israel need to hold on to it for how long? Can it give it up just for 6 weeks, a phase one of a deal? But one question worth asking is, why does it matter so much to Hamas? Why does it insist that Israel leave that turf? And I think the answer is pretty clear. Without control over that border area, Hamas has no oxygen. It can't smuggle people in and out. It can't smuggle weapons in. It can't smuggle all the rest of its supplies. And so when Israel holds that, Hamas is in deep, deep trouble and sort of constrained more and more all the time. Now, Hamas would like Israel to vacate. Egypt would also like Israel to vacate. Egypt has sort of been exposed here, having allowed all of these cross-border tunnels, but it would like a return to that status quo in which Hamas was smuggling all sorts of things across its border. The U.S. is in between them, having backed Israel's position somewhat that there needs to be an Israeli presence there to make sure Hamas can't simply rearm, but it is pressuring Israel for more and more concessions on this point. The latest that it has tried to claim is that a previous offer, which had mentioned that Israel would withdraw in the first phase of a deal from densely populated areas, well, that should cover the Philadelphia corridor as well. Well, it's not so densely populated. It's a, military zone, a sand and a paved road at this point. But when that deal was agreed to by Israel, rejected by Hamas, Israel didn't have control over the corridor in the first place. So Israel has since insisted it won't leave the corridor. It will hang on there. And that's the crucial area of disagreement right now.
But Bill, to that point, the trouble for Israel is that there have been reportedly about 150 tunnels that have been discovered underneath this corridor, including some passing into Egypt and big enough that a Jeep can go through them. And so going back to that statement by Kamala Harris, it is hard to see how Israel can cede control of that corridor between Gaza and Egypt and also ensure that Hamas does not control Gaza and begin to rearm and begin to plan again the next October 7th. So that is the difficulty in bridging this kind of divide. And the brutal reality is that once Hamas gives up these hostages, it loses what leverage it has.
Yeah, exactly. You made the point before that they're in contradiction. They're opposite goals. Agreeing to the ceasefire, pushing the ceasefire, that makes it harder for Israel to do what it has to do to eliminate the threat coming from Hamas. They just can't do it. As you point out, they can't seek control. They can't allow things to go back to October 6th, where Hamas is free to use the tunnels and so forth. So I think these demands for a ceasefire are really pernicious because, in effect, they reward Hamas for taking hostages, again, a war crime in the first place, and they have a bad effect. They prevent any real resolution of the issue that would eliminate Hamas's ability to threaten Israel. And that's, of course, why they do it. Hamas is very logical. They're pursuing a very rational policy. And in my opinion, they're abetted by the Biden-Harris administration.
Elliot, what is the alternative here for President Biden and for Kamala Harris if she truly believes that Hamas cannot be allowed to control Gaza and wants to ratchet up pressure on them in support of Israel, a U.S. ally? What are the kind of leverage points that the U.S. has over Hamas and its patrons?
Well, I think Hamas sees very clearly the messages that the White House sends. And so when it sees daylight between the U.S. and Israel, it knows, okay, we don't have to make concessions because Israel will. The U.S. will force Israel to, and therefore we can hold out just a bit longer for that deal that will allow us to survive. So the first thing is get rid of that daylight. Get rid of all of these spats in public. Say, Israel has made it very clear it isn't leaving Philadelphia corridor, therefore it isn't leaving. Let's, negotiate on after that. And you could come to some sort of deal that might actually work. Afterwards, you would need a U.S. guarantee that should Hamas violate the deal, the U.S. would support Israel's right to enforce that violation, which is to say, restart military operations, ensure Hamas cannot survive. Right now, Israeli policymakers hope that the U.S. would have their backs in that situation, but they can't really be certain about it, and that makes a deal much more difficult. I would say pressure on Hamas's patrons would go a long way. That means Iran and Qatar, and to some extent Turkey as well. Sanctions on Iran. That should be an easy one. We have all of these sanctions on the books already. But for instance, on oil, the major thing, the Biden administration has all but ceased enforcing oil sanctions, allowing tens of billions of dollars to flood into Iranian coffers. So if it wants to squeeze Hamas, if it wants to squeeze Hamas's patrons, all of these options are there for it. It just hasn't shown a willingness to try that strategy. And if I could just add one thing, sort of taking a step back and looking at this hostage deal on the table. In the first phase, which is the really crucial one, because that's the one that people think would happen. The others we're not so sure. But people think it would end up being 20 or so living hostages released, plus maybe a dozen more hostages who have already been killed. In exchange, it would not only be a massive release of Hamas terrorist prisoners in Israel. You know, we've seen that sort of deal before. A few hostages, Hamas releases in exchange for hundreds or even previously 1,000 Hamas terrorists in Israeli prisons. Maybe that's a bad deal, but it's something that we've seen before. We kind of know what to think about it. But what's being floated now goes far beyond that, because it's not only a prisoner exchange, it's also asking for Israel to make strategic concessions, withdraw from land in exchange for individual hostages. That's just not something that people have talked about in years past. We don't have experience with that. It's a huge ask. These are very heavy choices for Israel's leaders, its people. You could make an argument one way or the other, but when you have a choice that serious, it doesn't seem right for the U.S. to put so much pressure on one side, saying, allow Hamas to survive, give it back control of territory in exchange for one choice, the hostages. That's a choice for Israelis and not an easy one.